Hello and welcome back to the Business of Compliance podcast, the podcast by compliance executives for compliance executives like you. Today, we are honored to have with us Jake Nix, the founder and CEO of RISCPoint, a cybersecurity and compliance firm. Along with Jake, we have Chad Gross, the EVP of Compliance Services, also with RISCPoint. Fellas, welcome. Great to have some dialogue with you on camera. We talk so much off camera.
It'll be a great insight into what we say in the behind the scenes.
The behind the scenes of what really happens in the compliance business. And Jake, I mean, that being said, a lot has changed really since you've been in this business. I think your story is pretty interesting. You started out in audit. You decided there was an opportunity to create your own firm. I mean, maybe just a couple minutes on how you got to where you are.
Yeah, I would love to share that. And it's interesting because if we go all the way back to the beginning, I started in financial statement audit at Ernst & Young, and pretty quickly learned that ones and zeros are a lot more fun than financial statements. So moved into process control and IT audit, did that at PwC for a while, boomeranged back to EY to do consulting work, and just got to a point in my career where when you look at what somebody does wrong all day and you can easily fix it, but you're not allowed to, it gets a little mind-numbing. So having the opportunity to then do a little bit of hands-on work at Ernst & Young was a lot of fun. But then I found myself in a similar paradigm where EY Global had to approve the things that we were doing that were innovative. We had to stay within the confines of our SOWs and not really do something that was so easily impactful to our customers right in front of us because of all the bureaucracy and red tape. And so about 6.5 years ago, started RISCPoint with the entire concept being doing the right thing for our customers. And it, luckily enough, has resonated with the market. And we've been fortunate to grow every year since we were founded and find great people like Chad Gross to come and help us continue that mission.
Speaking of Chad Gross, if memory serves, you started in financial audit as well, didn't you?
Oh, that is correct. I started off with a small firm based out of Atlanta called PKM and cut my teeth there. I think one of the things that we didn't talk about too much in college was basically there's two paths I always talk about. You have tax and you have audit. What they don't ever talk about is IT audit. So doing my due diligence at the Meet the Firms events, I found that one of the firms there had this new startup in the cybersecurity space and said the right buzzwords at the time and got involved in cybersec from the very beginning. So I was fortunate to be involved in some of those projects. Similar to Jake, I did start with PKM and I was spending a lot of time at small, medium-sized banks in the middle of nowhere states. And I got to learn a lot there and learn what I don't want to do as a career. More importantly, so I then switched to EY at the time. So go from a small firm to one of the largest ones in the world and spent 6 months out of the year in Nashville, 6 months out of the year in Memphis at different clients. I'm like, this isn't that much fun either.
You don't like this.
Exactly. You're never home, but you get to meet a lot of cool people, meet a lot of cool technology, learn some stuff at major organizations out there. And then in 2014, I was fortunate enough to get picked up by Align when they're first getting started. I think I was somewhere around employee number 35 and spent the next 9 years with them. So I was always on the audit side of the desk, getting to do a lot of neat assessments in the SOC and ISO realm, and very fortunate got to be involved in the data privacy kind of upstart back in 2016 with the kind of start of the PR.
I was going to say you, in fact, created the privacy practice at Align.
I don't want to take all the credit for it because there's a team of very smart people that surrounded me during that implementation, but I was the practice leader for the firm. So got to do a lot of implementation, support clients with the GDPR and most recently CCPA, CPRA efforts.
My goodness. I mean, you guys have seen it all. You've seen it all. And Jake, I did not realize 6.5 years you've been out there on your own driving the message forward. Absolutely incredible, dude.
It's been a fun time. I gotta say, it's for me one of those things where we, myself and the firm, have been incredibly lucky to find good people. I mean, Patrick, we've known each other now for many years, and you've always been a fantastic partner and support. So that's kind of the common story for RISCPoint, and one of the things that AWS preaches and I think is becoming a lot more accepted is you can do a lot better together. And to continue the idea of, how do we work in a competitive space in a cooperative manner is really important, because if you look at it at a macro level, there's only so much that we can do to protect against other nation state actors. And so we're doing an important duty for our customers and for our country. And to think about it any other way than let's do what's right in cybersecurity is a little small-minded. So we've had a lot of success because of the fact that there's good people in this industry like you. There's good people like Chad. I mean, we sat across the table from each other and fought when he was the auditor and I was the consultant, and had that healthy conflict. And that's what led to us, finding each other now and having such a good professional as our EVP. So it's a crazy small world for sure.
And Jake, I mean, you mentioned that our community is really a global one. There isn't a nation on this planet that we don't actually have people working or know people because of the pervasiveness of the need for privacy and security controls. I don't know that traditional business executives necessarily have that view. I mean, as you guys are interacting with your customers or just having conversations with executives, do you get a sense that there's a real understanding of the need to act almost in unison, the need for everyone to walk together the same direction?
No, I think that the global impact is still something that is hard for many to grasp, right? Whether it be something as simple as data residency, which is an area Chad's an expert in, or how do we safely offshore to optimize talent and cost paradigm, right? And how do we evaluate our supply chain to determine whether or not other executives and other companies are doing so in a responsible way? That's the craziest part. There's a big gap in understanding how our total supply chain in a global world works.
And Chad, we think about data residency. Jake just brought up, as I think about privacy, particularly some of the things that we're seeing with state privacy regulations. I mean, are you seeing any common threads, any common themes that are more likely to impact businesses in the near future rather than just consumer-based protections?
Yeah, it's a great question. Data privacy at the state level has always been this mishmash of, states have their own individual rights and they try to do best by the, people they're trying to protect in their jurisdictions. And we have this mishmash of state regimes right now, and this is still lacking at the federal level of the U.S. government coming together and saying this is our true data privacy program, something like the GDPR. And so what we're seeing is basically states coming together and saying we need data privacy legislation that protects the residents of our states, and they're taking the best practices of the GDPR, or for the most part, which is based off generally accepted privacy principles, and try to incorporate that into their own states. Now, the issue with that is obviously we have very distinct definitions of what we define as personal data or personal information, slightly different rules as each state, defines these things locally. And it makes this almost an impossible ask for many businesses to keep up with. When you try to comply with 27 different state laws with different definitions, what's the most common theme? The easiest answer is we find the strictest path possible and implement the most strict rule that we possibly can in order to meet as many things as we possibly can as an organization. Yeah. And so that's a tough part for many businesses, understanding that, we exist in Cleveland, Ohio, but we also have data from 47 other states. And each of those data residents has different obligations we have to provide different levels of protection to. So it's a very, very time-consuming, very difficult ask these days for organizations to comply with data privacy at the state and federal level, for that matter.
Man, dude, one of the things I've noticed, and correct me if I'm wrong, I could be totally way off base, but it feels like in most state regulations, enforcement is left to the state attorneys general. And so as a consumer, I don't necessarily have leverage to trigger enforcement. It has to be triggered from the attorney general. So it almost feels like enforcement is more of a political thing today and in effect a show of force. But again, I could be way off base. I don't know if you have a perspective here.
I think that's fair. I mean, even at the individual level, consumers do have a right to report, known data violations or data privacy violations to the state attorney general, who is then responsible for enforcing action. And so with the California CCPA, CPRA implementation, they spun up a brand new office that does this, the OAG, and they have the CPPA with California Privacy.
Yes. Yeah.
This specific acronym escaped me, so maybe we can strike this piece from the conversation. But we'll come back to a specific definition for the CPPA, which is responsible for enforcement of the CPRA in the state of California. But again, individuals do have the right to report violations to those groups who then have to determine whether or not action is required from this.
Well, the interesting thing too that I've been seeing with some of, when we talk business impact with some of our customers, is in the void of consistent enforcement, the FTC and the FCC have started to, in some ways, reach or overreach to apply some sort of standard enforcement of data privacy when there's large breaches. And it becomes very bespoke to each individual organization. So there's not a good playbook to work with. And it's one of those areas where, the United States is supposed to be business friendly. It's, Patrick, we were talking about this the other day, libertarian in nature. We want the liberty and opportunity to go out and do something that is entrepreneurial.
As free a market as possible. Yes.
And there's nothing wrong with having regulations to protect our citizens and their rights, but it's very difficult when you slide the scale around at your will. And that's what's happening in the US is states choose, state regulators choose, state attorney generals choose, and then our court systems are not intended to deal with expertise. They're intended to deal with average law. And so when you look at the venue to protect yourself, you're dealing with someone on average in a jury trial or even the court system itself that is not an expert in a complex area. So yes. It's becoming more and more difficult every day to do the right thing because the right thing is not clear in the United States.
When to sit kneecap to kneecap with an executive who's having to make decisions about these sorts of things. I mean, what guidance do you have to offer?
I think Chad's guidance is best. I mean, we recently gave a training to some of the folks at AWS around data privacy and best practices. And, really, despite the fact that it somewhat hinders innovation, finding the best path is usually finding the most stringent. The good thing with data privacy is the general privacy principles are pretty ethical and not that invasive, right? So doing the right thing, being privacy by design is not counterintuitive to building a good product. And so there is a pretty nice safe harbor path. The hard part is getting the budget to do the right thing is very difficult for business executives.
Especially when it's framed in the context of doing the ethical thing. How do we take this squishy stuff and make it something empirical that we can attach dollars to so that the ROI is actually there? I mean, what does that even look like? Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, you have such a hyper-competitive tech space. We see the layoffs across the board. And then you're looking at the fact that people need to get their roadmap developed and features to market. And then we're sitting there saying, well, the United States doesn't really have a standard for this, but we should do it by adding 4 weeks of security impact analysis and data mapping before we go live with this. And you're gonna lose that argument every time because it's too unclear for a business executive to say to investors, to the board, to the strategy, we're going to add all of this time and be slower to market because we think it might be the right thing to do.
And Jake, you just brought up something that's kind of near and dear to my heart right now. You mentioned data mapping. That, I know you guys are really on the leading edge of advising organizations on how to prepare for ISO 42001, the new ISO standard around building an AI management system and AIMS. One of the provisions, one of the controls in 42001 is to have a data provenance process, an understanding of where your data comes from, how it's processed, and where it goes to be disposed of, to rest in peace, for lack of better words.
Yep.
I mean, are you guys finding that organizations are in any way prepared for this? Because frankly, I'm concerned. I'm concerned that the general public, the general community is ready to take this on.
Well, it's interesting, and I want to give Chad space to talk about this too, but my first reaction to AI is there's two risks that are pervasive across the industry that we're seeing. One is use of AI. right? How do you actually leverage and harness this to make your processes better? And the other is utilizing AI in products and services. And both are equally dangerous when you don't actually understand what you're working with.
Yes.
There's a ton of clients who did not do anything to prevent their users from utilizing ChatGPT open service when it first came out. And there was a lot of IP that was put into ChatGPT that they no longer have control over. So there's definitely a very high level of FUD in the marketplace. And that's the exciting part about the ISO standard, but it's not enough in and of itself. Chad, I'd love to turn it over to you for some thoughts before I go too far down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, data mapping is a very difficult exercise for many organizations because it takes a ton of stakeholders to understand, again, where data is even coming from. To be able to create that inventory, we have all these ingestion points and all these funnels into the business from sales and marketing and the ways we actually make money as a business from our core operations. We have to define those and understand what data inputs are truly coming in. Yes. And this exercise can take days or weeks depending on sophistication of the systems and what tools we're able to leverage to actually determine that. There's a lot of neat scanning technology out there. I know OneTrust has got some pretty cool tools they can utilize to actually go out there and scan a repository and say you may have this sort of information sitting in these buckets or sitting over here, and maybe PCI data, maybe it's personal data, maybe it's EPHI, and gives us a general sense of where data resides within our different systems. But for folks who are not utilizing sophisticated tools like that, it's very difficult to do the exercise. It's truly a very human portion to sit down with your human resources team and say, we have people that are based in California, we have people based in London, we have people in Sofia, Bulgaria, or wherever they may be. And then to understand from a human resources perspective, we have these obligations. And from an operations perspective, we have these obligations, which are entirely different. So to bring in like GDPR terminology, we can be both a controller and a processor at the exact same time, depending on the specific processing activity that we're talking about. And I think a lot of folks have a very myopic view of understanding that you can be both a data controller and a processor at the exact same time, depending on what process activity that we're talking about. So yes. It's not the one-size-fits-all approach where we're truly a controller or processor. It comes down to the specific nuance of what we're actually speaking about is whether or not you're a controller or processor, which defines your obligations. So it's a very tedious process. It takes a pretty considerable amount of time to do so, but I think taking the best faith effort and getting that process started and just understanding what those flows are to get them on a sheet of paper, and then we can start mapping out the security protocols of, where this data resides, who we're sharing with, who has access to this, what security layers on top of this. Are we sharing this with any third parties? Do we have a DPA in place with them? There's a whole slew of things we have to analyze, but it starts with just understanding what the funnels are and how do we intake information.
And Chad, to your point, and guys, I think of it like a workout routine. They say the hardest part is putting your shoes on. In so many ways, the hardest part of this is just getting started. There are solid structures out there, and Chad, I'm sure you can recommend some solid frameworks for folks to follow. But the hardest part really is getting started in my mind. But privacy in and of itself, the more and more I read, and you guys can probably correct me, I think you're probably more expert at this than I, but the more and more I read as I think about responsible use of AI tools, there seem to be a three-legged stool, if you will, that everything comes back to. Privacy, explainability, and bias. Are we ensuring the privacy of the data that we're using to train our models? Do we know where that data is coming from? Can we explain what process that data is going through to get to this decision making, this output? And then how are we ensuring that that bias is free of output? And if it is, to feed back to the beginning so that it's not as we continue to run these automated algorithms. But none of that is possible if we don't know where the data is coming from in the first place.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was in a SOC working group yesterday with Steve Simmons, your guys' chief operating officer.
Good guy.
Brilliant guy, fantastic in the market, just knows his stuff. And he made a really good point because we were talking through AI and the impact to audit firms and the impact to the SOC 2 and what the ICPA should do about it. And he was talking through, private models. And one of the points I made is you got to be really careful with how do you evaluate the model itself, because if you have 4 auditors on the bench that then train the model, and your 4 auditors on the bench aren't very good because they're on the bench, you don't have a model that's not a very good auditor. Right? So it can't just be something, and this is, I've seen this in conversations with the big cloud service hyperscales. I've seen it with our customers where they think that artificial intelligence means it's going to bring expertise. But all it really is a big math equation that you're teaching it exactly how to solve. And so, to your point, the piece that I don't know that we have established yet is the engine actually accurate? Is it doing what we want 50% of the time, 90% of the time, or no percent of the time? And that's something that even with the ISO 42001 standard, I don't yet see an answer in the market for, can we rely consistently on what this thing generates?
And Jake, one of the things I've noticed, and again, I welcome your coaching on this. I might have a short-sighted view, but as we do think about bias, in my mind, the algorithms have to be audited. And there are some companies out there doing some really forward-looking research, like Babel AI, led by Jay Brown, doing incredible research to line out how to do an effective algorithmic audit. Mm-hmm. Because it is, to your point, just an automated mathematical equation, for lack of better words. What we're saying is that we're force-feeding sins of the past into this automated machine and having it tell us how we used to make decisions, which is exactly where the bias comes into play. Yep. What I don't know that the traditional cybersecurity audit market is prepared for is to understand what to do with that, which is really where I think the opportunity, kind of the next opportunity for organizations like yours, is to step in and help folks understand what that means and how they can apply some corrective control to ensure that it doesn't continue to be pervasive.
100%. I think, from my perspective, when we talk about this, it goes all the way back to basic software design, right? You have exhaustive test case, you have exhaustive results expected, and you run through them. And you do so in a way that's intelligent and independent, and that gives you the opportunity to understand, is this doing what we think it needs to do? But even a step further, when we talk about how is it going to impact cybersecurity and the market as a whole, our work in security and protection of assets becomes that much more important, because the more that we rely upon these AI engines, table stakes is we better make sure the engine's trustworthy. We get unexpected results. We need to figure that out. And I think that, folks like you in the space that are experts, that are leading the charge to make awareness that this is important and we need to talk about it, and there's not a good answer yet, that's critical. Once we get to that point and we have stasis there, we need to be really sure that there's nobody in those systems doing inappropriate things. And so those table stakes that we're starting to not talk about in this area become hyper important. Because once we actually rely on those AI engines, if we're not actually protecting them and a bad actor gets in there, and we have false confidence in the work that we're doing for reliability of the engine, then we're really in trouble. So I think there's going to be a lot of moments, and I hope that we get ahead of it and they're not reactionary moments in this space.
The pendulum will swing. And Jake, to that end, thinking about just this, overwhelm of details that people have to think through. One of the things that's helped me in the past is to use more abstract models. Do you think there's a place in this for executives to use something like, the NIST cybersecurity framework? Is that a model that offers any sort of help in people thinking through, again, at a high level, at a 30,000 foot view, what needs to be done to ensure that they are protecting both the privacy and security of the data that they're handling?
Yeah, I think there needs to be, ideally, at top leadership or at a board level, a plan for how are we going to responsibly use this? How are we going to create this, put it into the market, and make sure that it's protected? And then how are we also going to use it as an organization? NIST is fantastic in what they put forward because it's free, it's generally unbiased, and the intention there is to be not just state of the art in what they're trying to do, but also transparent. So I'm a big proponent of anything that NIST does. That being said, I don't think they figured it out yet either. I just don't think there's a single solution out there that's going to get you to a responsible place for AI. Chad, I don't know. The thing that I'd be interested in your opinion here is when I look at AI and what the EU is doing, it reminds me a lot of data privacy and the way that GDPR led the charge. So I would love your thoughts on what do you see happening? Who's going to lead the charge here? Is it going to be the EU because they went first?
That's a great question. It seems to be trending that way. Like the EU AI Act is something that could be sweeping very much in a similar fashion to the GDPR, which was like the global spark, if you will, for data privacy back in 2016 and fully went live in 2018. I do want to talk about the NIST privacy management framework as well. I don't think we should be just on security framework here because there's the other half of that kind of model there that often gets left out for whatever reasons. The privacy management framework did come out after the CSF, but it is focused on the other half of the principles there of how to protect data privacy. So anyone going down the CSF path should definitely think to include that and talk about data privacy obligations there. Again, it's predicated on the idea of basic generally accepted privacy principles, what organizations should be doing to ensure data privacy within any new systems that they're developing, within the current systems they have in place. It gives them a good maturity model. See, this is how well we're operating right now on that 1 to 5 scale, and then try to get the 1 to 4 scale, and then get to where they ultimately want to be, their best in class solution.
And then, so with that maturity model, Chad, is that they, based on their own assessment, determine where they are and then set their goals for where they want to be? Is that kind of how that works?
That's a great question. There are ultimately 2 approaches. You can have an independent assessment where you have a third party come in, such as RISCPoint or Align can do the assessment as well.
Okay.
Come in a viewpoint from an objective third party and say, this is where we think you're scoring based on our industry expertise and what we've been able to see with other organizations out there. So it does give you a little more assurance that it's an unbiased opinion, if you will, from an outside third party to say, this is how well we think you're operating based on what you've told us. But it's not a certifiable framework in the sense that, there's no reason an organization can't do it themselves, but they may not be critical on their own system as they as a third party would be.
Nobody thinks their baby's ugly. Certainly.
You're right. We get paid professionally to tell people their baby's ugly and how to make it prettier.
But Jake, you hit on something, and I want to comment on this just to offer it up for discussion. But you kind of drew the parallel between the EU AI Act and GDPR and the European Union leading. Kind of my opinion here is that I don't think. Let me say this: there's a sentiment in the market today that Europe jumped the gun a little bit. That maybe it's a little too soon for the AI Act to have passed. A lot of unknowns. I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing, but I do think in this 2-year interim period, as we wait on enforcement of those lower risk systems, I think ISO 42001 becomes even more important because it is a certifiable standard. And though it doesn't meet line by line the same goals of the EU AI Act, by and large, it does give organizations a way to think through in a very structured manner what to do to ensure that they're using and delivering AI in a responsible fashion. So I think the work that you guys are doing, that organizations like Align are doing, that many other organizations are doing to educate the market on ISO 42001 and then certify, honestly, I think this next couple of years are going to be huge for us because there is such a demand. I don't know if that resonates with you.
Yeah, no, 100% it does. The interesting thing is you can draw parallels to GDPR and data privacy very easily. EU came out hot in 2016. They delayed in 2018, and it created a little bit of confusion in the market that still sticks to this day, where organizations look at data privacy and they say, that's not a problem, we're not in Europe. Or they look and say, that's not a problem, we're not in California. But the longer they go without having a good data privacy program, the more expensive it is when they remediate it. And even worse, it is potentially expensive, not just in creating better value and better systems, but also fines. Because as the GDPR grows and these data protection authorities grow and have more fines, they have more budget to audit, right? And that is a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes.
What I see that's going to be different about AI is twofold. One, these are complex systems. We're not putting data in a database where we can go delete it, mask it, or remediate later. When we're doing this, there's no undo, there's no reverse. There is potential that you either have to get rid of your entire model if you're doing something inappropriate, or you're just going to be in violation in perpetuity. And so the complexity of the technology that we're working with in large language models and other AI engines is something where if you don't get it right from the start, you could find yourself in a much worse position than you do in data privacy in 2 years.
Oh my goodness. So an organization could potentially dig themselves into a hole that they could never make it out of.
That tech debt is crazy. I mean, we're not talking about some simple traceability to, we used it in these 4 databases and these tables and we can fix it. It is much more complex in the way that it operates from a technical perspective. The other piece that I think will be a stark contrast to GDPR is this is very much so something that will go into vendor risk management and supply chain. And this is very much something that will go into contracts and prevent business. And so these organizations that don't lean into the ISO standard, that don't lean into the NIST standards, that aren't thinking about this, they're going to find themselves with a year worth of work and a month's worth of procurement, and they're going to lose contracts.
So interesting you're saying this. I participated in a conversation yesterday. Some of the firms in the EU with government contracts are being asked to fill out an AI questionnaire now, very much like the SIGs and security questionnaires we get here in the States.
Yep.
So how long is it until domestic companies are faced with the same thing, until it's no longer just a security questionnaire, an e-SIG, but essentially how are you handling AI?
We have multiple customers in the healthcare space that are getting those today from large insurance companies.
Are they really?
And when they don't answer them well, it is preventing business. It is. And you know, if you think about HIPAA and the concerns and issues with healthcare data in the United States, it is exactly what the insurance companies and large hospitals should be doing. They should be questioning whether or not these telehealth platforms are doing inappropriate things with healthcare data. You know, you can't train a model inappropriately with cancer research. You know, that is against our human rights. And that is something that they are smart to be cautious of and doing their due diligence in. And, you know, healthcare usually leads vendor due diligence in the United States, but other organizations won't be far behind.
And Chad, I don't know if you have any thoughts. You look like you were about to say something.
I just think it's important to note that, you know, there's some of the rollout of the GDPR, like the rule is coming, right? This is a 2 years we have to prepare for this thing to be enforced. So now's not the time to necessarily sit around and wait for enforcement to happen. And, you know, in a couple of years, the guidelines haven't been laid down. And now is the time for the business for us to interpret those, what it means for us as an organization, and get ready for that enforcement date. Not sit around for the next 2 years and hope that this thing may change or the rules soften. It's coming. It's going to happen. The enforcement will be there. We need to take actionable steps now to get prepared for that. To your point, I think ISO 20 or the new ISO standard is the way to go for that right now, because it does lay out a nice framework for implementing data privacy as for AI exclusively here. But the enforcement's going to happen. It's not going to stall. It's not going to be delayed. We have 2 years to prepare for that, and now is the time to take action.
Well, and Patrick, one of the things that you guys are doing is helping organizations before the ISO certification body process happens, right? You can get folks through the ISO standard. One of the things that we're excited about is partnering with you guys to help folks with their risk assessment. Like, they can get on the books now to get this done. I don't know, in 6 months, we're not going to be in a FedRAMP scenario where we only have so many educated folks that can do this. And it's a 7-month wait to get on, you know, the RISCPoint books and the Align books to get this done.
And Jake, that is a concern of mine, and something you and I have talked about offline. You know, as a certifying body, a CB, if you will, from ISO language, we absolutely have the ability to do readiness assessment and certification, ultimate certification against the standard. But we have to defer guidance and advisory work to organizations like yours to help people create the things that are then audited. And guys, in my mind, there's 2 big areas that make 42001 not scary, that give me pause for concern. And those sit squarely in the AI risk assessment and the AI impact assessment. These are two assessments that are fundamentally different than I think most organizations have ever gone through before. Because of the term risk assessment, I think people just think, well, this is going to be me sitting in a room kind of brainstorming potential threats to some unnamed assets. And that's not the case at all.
No.
I mean, Chad, I don't know if you guys have a perspective on this, but I'd love to hear it.
I mean, I will say this is an area where I get a little ivory tower in the risk assessment space in and of itself, because like when you think about traditionally the way most organizations do a risk assessment, it is the definition of a check the box exercise. It should be the starting point of every good compliance program. It's not. That is 5% of organizations at best. But when you think about it in the context of AI, to your point, it is not feasible to do a paper exercise for an AI risk assessment and AI impact assessment. That is something where you have to have not just expertise in AI in your team, but you also have to have expertise in how to assess the risk and impact of AI. And that's, to me, that's an area where, again, if there was more talented resources in the space, Chad would sleep a lot more. But it is already an area where we see constraint issues, and that's where people need to get moving now. Chad, I'd love to. Sorry, go ahead, Patrick.
I was going to say, Chad, I don't know if you have thoughts.
No, it's very well stated. It's not like the typical risk assessment where we're sitting there just defining threats and likelihoods and impact these events occur, and there's a whole lot that goes into this process. Another resource I was failing to mention earlier on was the AI Risk Management Framework from NIST. They came out in January of this year. I think they have some nice tutorials on how to think about doing a risk assessment as it relates to AI. Came out in January. It's a nice playbook, if you will, of how to think about conducting a risk assessment over an AI platform itself. So that's another great methodology that we typically utilize when we're asked these sorts of questions.
And then, guys, do you know if there's a preference in ISO 42001 for either the ISO AI risk assessment standard or NIST risk management framework? Does ISO even care what you use as long as you have a formalized structure?
As long as we're meeting the control guidance from ISO and meeting each applicable criteria that they're outlining there, I think the format is a little bit up to the implementation and certification body to make sure it's in conformance with requirements. But the path therein, I think, leaves some room for interpretation.
Awesome.
Yeah, I agree with that. My only piece is I always love the little extra brownie points you get when you stay within ecosystems. So I think ISO to ISO is your foolproof bet. But to Chad's point, if you're working with a good, competent advisor, then you can make either work without issue.
Awesome. And then, guys, just to say this for our listeners, I mentioned my concern around these assessments being fundamentally different. Jake and Chad mentioned specific reasons why. But one thing that you have to understand is as we think about AI use, you really have to switch the paradigm of your thinking from a closed system just inside the walls of your organization to an open system. And so as we think about risks, we also have to consider external risks. We also have to consider external impacts. Should there be some misalignment between your expectations of the functioning of one of your algorithms and what it's actually doing? So that the world suddenly becomes interconnected as we begin using AI systems in our organization. So it's something not to be taken lightly, which again is why reaching out now and contacting organizations like RISCPoint to get started is so vitally important,
Well, I mean, that's the piece from my perspective that's going to be critical as well, is, having organizations like Align invest so much into doing this early on is really a benefit to the community, because ultimately without expertise and the charge that you're leading here, folks are going to get left behind. And just kind of throwing it back to Chad's point earlier about the value of having an external provider that has benchmarking and the ability to give you that unbiased view. And to your recent point around external factors, there's only so much you can do when you're sitting in one organization every day to think about what is going to happen to the external world. Having many of these under our belts and working together with partners like Align, we could bring that context. And that's one of the areas where something like this is more valuable because, I could say when I used to sit at a single client all day long for the entire year when I worked at Ernst & Young, I thought in the context of that client.
World's pretty small. Yeah.
There's only so many different ways you can manage the risk of designing shoes. If you get out there and start thinking about other things, it's a little bit different, right? And so having organizations like Align that does, multiple thousands of organizations a year, that's a big value add to considering what does it mean for my AI engine to not do something it's supposed to do.
And guys, as we kind of get toward the end of our time and really think about ramping things up, I think I'm going to ask a little bit of a longer question, a short question, longer answer. Again, you guys are seasoned professionals, executives with lots of time in seat. Your counsel for other either compliance or general business executives that are thinking about how to build a solid cybersecurity, privacy, AI strategy. 5 years is too much, but even over the next 2 years, are there one or two things that you think are most critical, most important for executives to know and be planning on today?
I think from my perspective, one area that everyone needs to start with is understanding their business. So we see a lot of cyber and compliance executives get myopic in the topics that they think through and the lens that they put on things, but the best that we've seen and worked with understand their business and go to market and then apply compliance and security to it. Once they get the business understanding or assuming that they already have that, to me, it's measuring sticks. You go get your NIST CSF, you do your NIST privacy, you get an understanding, where are we today? If you don't actually have a true introspective look at what is current state, you have no ability to go and get a good future state. Between those two, understanding your current state and the way your business works, you can align your compliance and security objectives to business objectives. And that's how you get your budget. That's how you get your impact. That's how you need to communicate to make the program successful over the next 2 years. And of course, if you're not out there doing the right things in AI, you're going to get left behind. So get that baseline and almost in a parallel track. If you think you're going to be using or creating AI, you need to get a strategy around it. Because it's going to
say this, to supplement Jake's statement, you will be creating or using AI. It's simply the way the world is going.
Yes.
And Jake, what I think is so cool about your counsel is it lines up very similarly to what Chad was talking about with the maturity model in both the CSF and the, Chad, what was the privacy management framework?
That's exactly what it is. PMF, Privacy Management Framework.
Perfect. Yeah. And Chad, your thoughts? I mean, a couple of things that execs have to be thinking about today.
I think there's 2 points I want to make. The first one is we typically see a number of organizations that think that compliance means you have good security, and those two concepts are not always associated together. So just having a SOC 2 report or ISO certification in hand does not necessarily mean that you have, best in class security. If anything, compliance is the output of good security, and that's kind of a mind shift for a lot of folks to say that we don't need to just get a SOC 2 report, but the SOC 2 should be the outcome of everything else that we're doing as an organization because we're doing the right things all the time. And that process should be really simple for organizations to have security focus first, and then compliance be the output of that.
Interesting.
The second point I want to make is relative to data privacy, and it's just a simple acronym that I was thinking about, but to me, data privacy boils down to one thing, and that is trust. And it's a quick acronym I put together, but trust in privacy means one, the T is transparency. Have to be very transparent in the way we're operating, the way we're ingesting data, and the way we're working that data.
Yes.
We have a responsibility to protect consumer data or personal data that's given to us as an organization. So we have to apply appropriate security controls to that information. The U is we have to understand our obligations. So just because we exist in Nebraska does not mean we don't have GDPR obligations here. We have a whole slew of things we have to comply with because we have data that flows from all over the world. Even though we have one brick and mortar building that sits somewhere in the US, we still have a ton of obligations here, and we need to understand that. The S is for security. I know I already mentioned this one a little bit, but privacy is predicated on having a good security posture in place to be able to protect that data to a commensurate level with the risk of the data that's presented. So if we're not processing sensitive categories of personal information like sexual orientation, philosophical beliefs, blood type, things of that nature, we don't have to apply the same level of security to the different types of data. If we have a lot of sensitive data, obviously it's going to be very protected, enhanced security, very isolated in the environment versus just general personal data, which is like business to business, first name, last name, email address, etc. And the last thing to wrap it up is the T, training. We have to let people know in the organization that we have obligations and you can't do willy-nilly stuff with people's information. So we have to define parameters. We need to follow those policies, procedures internally and make sure that we're processing data in a transparent manner and that our people are trained on those obligations. So when we do receive one of those data subject to access requests, we know what to do and we're not just in the room pointing fingers saying, I thought you did this, or I thought HR did that, or I thought legal handed this. We understand what our obligations are. But again, to me, it all boils back to that level of trust.
I love the acronym, and I'm so sorry I interrupted while you were talking. It just struck me what was happening. We'll make sure that goes in the show notes. Yeah, that absolutely will go in the show notes. Thank you, Chad.
Of course.
Chad is trademarked that, so you actually have to pay him a penny every time you use it. But you can make the check out to his home address. I'll give that for the show notes too.
So if I change the order for the show notes, is it the same? TTRUS. Is there That's so funny you mentioned trust. I actually heard a double reference. Shay Brown talks about, in the 80s, we saw an arms race where individual organizations, individual countries, that is, were slowly escalating the amount of arms they kept stockpiled just to be sure that they could protect themselves from other countries. As it relates to AI, he used the analogy of a trust race, and that is trustworthy AI use will be the next race that we see in the market. Organizations, in order to continue to play, are going to have to show that they're using AI not only responsibly, but in a way that can be trusted by everyone in their supply chain. So, Jake, to your point, it really is a supply chain concern. Everyone's impacted. And that's what I think is fundamentally different about both the regulation, the EU AI Act, and ISO 42001 is, largely policing is pushed down to individual organizations to ensure that their supply chain is clean, which makes it fundamentally different than anything I've dealt with before. I'm not sure if it's the same for you guys or not.
Yeah, I think, if there's a parting note for me, hearing Chad's 2 points and your fantastic point there, somewhere around 2019, the paradigm shifted as to what compliance meant. And what it historically was intended for was giving customers the ability to trust the good things that you do. It was, we have good processes, we engage a reputable auditor. This is a report that allows you to trust when you're consuming our services, we're doing the right thing. And the best customers that we work with use that term every day, day in and day out. Are we doing the right thing for the customer to provide a trustworthy service? In 2019, we started to see a lot of options to start with compliance and say, I have a report, don't look at what I'm doing, trust me. And that is something that needs to continue to change and fall apart for the industry to get better. It's an issue, and it's something that we need to heal, because if you think about it, a third-party trust report that is engaged only to get the report is worthless. When you think about doing the right thing for your customers, building a good security program, building a good AI engine, and then having a trustworthy independent assessor come in and confirm that you're doing the right thing, that is what this industry is built on, not designing a program to make sure that you pass your audit every year. And that's where I think, as we continue to see progress in 2024 and 2025, we'll get back to that. And that is what we need to focus on as a community and as our organizations evolve.
Jake, thank you. And for what it's worth, support you any way I can. I absolutely believe in what you're doing, man. Yeah.
Appreciate you. No, we love what you guys are doing, and we appreciate the fact that there are good auditors out there still looking for the right things.
Thank you. Fellas, again, thank you. Thank you so much for making the space. Thanks for investing in the community. I'll have your contact available for any of the execs watching that want to reach out. Yeah, thank you. Super grateful for you guys. And to our listeners, thank you again for tuning in. We hope to have more content produced for you soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Patrick. Appreciate the time. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, sir.